How does this really benefit the growth of our podcast? How do we use this engagement to essentially get more listeners? Is that possible?
Absolutely. Because it starts with that person you're engaging with. They want to tell other people. And that is your most powerful evangelist for your podcast is your listener, the person already consuming your podcast, already engaged. They are the greatest force for helping to grow your podcast because they can use their own opinions and enthusiasm for your show to get other people listening to your show as well. Also, when you start using this feedback, your podcast can eventually become known as a podcast that engages with its audience and that answers the audience's needs or whatever type of thing your podcast does. For example, give a shout out here to another podcast. That Story Show is a podcast that shares funny life stories. It's a family-friendly, clean comedy podcast. And they have become known as the family-friendly funny story show where they share funny life stories. And so lots of people like to send in their funny life stories to that show, That Story Show. It's a great name for that show. And that helps grow their audience because they are known for that. They provide great value. And the people who then send those stories in and have their stories shared in the podcast, they want to tell everyone else because it's funny. They like sharing their own funny stories. Hey, hear my funny story in this podcast. When you also look at your engagement as what you can do, what you as the podcaster can do with that engagement outside of the podcast as well. Like you can look for places where people have asked similar questions as your audience has asked for your podcast and answered. Like take Reddit or Facebook groups. Now, anytime you look into an online community, make sure you're following the rules. Some groups are very strict about what they call self-promotion. But in general, if you're providing value first, they're often more forgiving of letting you promote something that builds on top of the value you're already giving. So let's say one of your audience members asks you the question, how do I fix this problem on my car? And you have a car podcast. So you answer that question, how to fix that problem on their car. Then you get into the social networks and you see other people ask that same question. So you can go comment on that, give the brief answer, give value first, and then you can say, by the way, one of my listeners for my podcast asked this question too, and you can hear me talk about it in this episode of my podcast. So now you've got very targeted, specific promotional opportunities around the content that you created that was inspired by the feedback that you gained from your audience. And there's something extra special about it. Instead of just saying, I created this episode that addresses this, to I created this episode that someone else was asking this same question. It feels validating, I think, for someone to see, oh, yeah, other people have the same question I do, and you answered it for her. That might be a good answer for me too. I'm more interested in it. So it makes you more relatable and helps give you those opportunities. You can also look at things like even when you approach sponsors, look at any of the praise that you've received in feedback, and you can show that off to sponsors or potential partners to show, here's what my audience is saying. Here's the impact my podcast is making on my audience. Look at the change my audience is achieving through my podcast. Look at whatever that thing is that your audience, the value they are getting from your podcast. When you can demonstrate that to a partner, a promotional opportunity, a sponsor, things like that, that can be more compelling than merely numbers, because then they see, wow, you have a good connection with your audience and you are impacting your audience. You're not just someone that people listen to and forget about, but you're changing the lives of your audience members. We want to be part of this in some way, or we want to help you grow too, or we want to sponsor, we want to include you in our event. All of those opportunities and things start to compound like that as you really diversify how you are growing your show.